Hello, in today's video we'll be replacing the starter on this 2005 Honda Civic. This starter is located underneath this intake resonator box, which you probably won't be able to get a look at the starter from here, but it's somewhere under there. The reason I'm replacing this starter is when you go to crank it, more and more often the starter gear will try to click out, but doesn't. And it will take a few tries before it eventually does. It's one of the many symptoms when a starter begins to go bad. Let's begin with the removal. The first thing we want to do is disconnect the negative battery terminal, and to do this you'll want to use a 10mm socket or a wrench to loosen the tightening nut. And now that it's loose, just remove the terminal and move it out of the way so it won't touch the battery. Now to remove this resonator, we'll have to remove a few bolts using a 10mm socket and maybe an extension or two for a couple of the bolts to make removing them easier. And next the second bolt, which is on the top right of the intake resonator. Now for this third one, it's located just a little below that one. I use this magnetic socket to help remove the bolt and avoid it falling down. Next we want to remove this attached intake hose from the left side of the resonator. Finally, this last bolt, located just below that hose that we just removed. And again I use a magnetic socket that I have to remove the bolt. This socket has a small magnet in the middle to keep the bolts from falling down. You'll want to pull back on the resonator to separate it from the filter box, then we can completely remove the intake resonator. Just gotta maneuver it around any of the cables or components that get in the way. And with that removed, it exposes our starter. This starter is held on by two bolts on opposite ends. We'll want to disconnect the electrical connection starting with the crank signal wire. For this one, all you gotta do is pull back on the connector to slide it off. For the starter battery wire, you'll want to pull back the boot enough to expose the nut holding down the wire. Now to remove the nut, you'll want to use a 12mm socket. After loosening it, you'll want to be careful not to drop the nut. Now we can just lift out the wire terminal. For removing the actual starter, you'll want to use a 14mm socket and an extension to remove the two bolts. You'll want to just break the first bolt loose and continue on to the second bolt. Now to loosen and remove the second bolt, you'll find it a little tucked in behind the starter. Once you break it loose, you should be able to remove the rest by hand. You'll also notice that this bolt is a little longer than the other bolt, so you'll want to pay attention to this on the install. Coming back to this first bolt, you'll want to hold the weight of the starter off of the bolt so it makes it easier to come off. Once that bolt is removed, we can remove the starter. This is the replacement starter I'll be using. You'll want to make sure that it matches all around before trying to install it, although this new one has an extra bracket piece, but that shouldn't affect anything. We can now go ahead and install a new starter. You'll also want to have one bolt ready to also thread into the hole. Once you get the first bolt started and make sure that it's holding in place, you can install a second bolt. For the second bolt, we can install it and tighten it completely. Followed by tightening it with the ratchet and torque it to spec if you prefer. And now back to tightening the first bolt. With the starter tightened down, now we just need to do the electrical connections, starting with the main battery terminal. You'll want to get the wire on first and hold it down while you install the lock nut followed by the nut. You don't want to tighten this too much as it can break the assembly easily. Now just cover it with the boot and install the starter crank terminal by sliding it on the pin. I like to pull back on the small boot so I can guide it in better. Once you get it on, just push in as far as it goes and give it a small pull to make sure that it grabs. Followed by installing the intake resonator with the 4 bolts plus reattaching the hose. And this is what your setup should look like after everything's installed. Now we can reattach the battery terminal and tighten the nut. And checking to make sure that the cable's on tight. And finally, making sure that we fix the problem. Which it definitely sounds like we did. Well, I hope you were able to find this video helpful and informative. If you did, please click that thumbs up button to support my video and my channel. And please subscribe if you haven't done so.